Week I had several pastoral encounters that I know will stick with me for the rest of my life. First of all, I went to visit a particular parishioner of our parish here in Greencastle who was homebound, and she has a condition where she's basically bedridden, and many of us who bring communion to her on a weekly basis have tried to encourage her to consider a nursing home, but she still lives in a home by herself, and had a nursing care place that was taking care of her but dropped her for some unknown reason. And so she was went without care for several days, unbeknownst to anyone. And then she asked a couple of other people who lived near her to come and care for her, and they basically took her credit cards and ran off. And she had been then stuck at home. Someone found her. So when I went to visit her, she was in the hospital. So went to visit her there. And so Adult Protective Services is involved, and all these other, a lot of our parishioners that have known of this and have been there trying to help her as well. But again, just an encounter with someone in that particular situation, living in somewhat subhuman conditions, in not just her medical situation, but also her living conditions and living quarters, etc. And that when you go into a situation like that and are ministering in that, that impacts you. That sticks with you, and you all, probably a lot of you have had those times as well. Then later in the week at the other in Brazil, the other parish decided, I was invited to, our director of religious education has been participating in the summer food program that daily packs up lunches for all the kids in the community that don't have a lunch. In the school year, they get the lunch program through the school, but they don't have lunch in the summer. So churches in the area, including ours, we've raised money for that and go out and drive the food to them and bring it to door type of ministry. And so I went out on the route, and the long story short, a couple of streets away from my rectory in Brazil, there were people living in cinder block homes with dirt floors, and again, just very challenging conditions. And bringing the food to the kids, you just saw the crosses that they were carrying. You could see it in their eyes, and it's understandable. And when we were talking as we were driving around, how does a young person go to school, in this situation? How does a young person come home and study? Just all of the challenges and difficulties that these young people face, and their parents too, right? It's not like the only ones suffering are the kids. A lot of times we say, well, the parents made choices, but they're suffering too, right? So they're just real poverty, real, for whatever reason, that's the situation that people were living in, and seeing that again. And being reminded of that this week is, again, something that sticks with you. And so you can't help but then read the readings for the weekend in light of what's been going on, and particularly with a very emotional week like that, this past week. So taking those experiences to prayer and taking that to Mass, both of those days had Mass after that. So just kind of bringing all of that to prayer, to Mass, and trying to kind of not solve it, not make sense of it, but just kind of start to say, okay, process it. Where's God in this? What am I supposed to be doing? And etc. And so I think I found great comfort and great motivation and great guidance, if you will, in this particular feast that we have this weekend of Corpus Christi, celebrating the Eucharist, right? So if we look back at the readings really quickly, in the first reading we have a reminder of the Israelites wandering the desert. They did it for 40 years. We all know that. Pretty early on the journey, a couple of weeks in probably, they started doing what most human beings do, complaining about the food. You know, these grasshoppers aren't cutting it, whatever, you know. So God says, as God typically does, answers prayers like 400%. He gives them cinnamon rolls all over the ground. Manna, bread mixed with honey and sugar and all these things. Basically pastries, right? Or something that they would have never even imagined when they were like, hey, we don't really like the food. They probably weren't picturing dessert. And they got it every morning for 40 years. You know, every morning. Day after day after day after day. Every morning they went out, no matter where they were at, when they walked out of their tents, breakfast, ready to go, in the desert, right? And yet they started taking that for granted too. But Jesus references that into the gospel. He says, that was manna, that food nourished the body. He says, I am the fulfillment of that bread. I am now giving myself, not just giving you cinnamon rolls, dessert in the morning, I am literally giving you myself to consume, my flesh, my body, my blood. That's the fulfillment of the manna. Right? That's what we remember in the Eucharist. That's what we believe, and that's the central mystery, one of the central mysteries of our faith. That's one of those things that sets us apart. We believe it's not a sign. That Jesus was very clear, I'm giving you my whole self. I'm emptying myself out. So often we think about, you know, like, in one sense, how hard it is to get to heaven, right? Think about how hard it was to leave heaven. But Jesus left the comfort of the Father and the Holy Spirit, the relationship, the presence, you know, all that heaven is in that relationship of the Trinity. He came down. And so in that sense, he provides a model. So for me, in my situation, what am I supposed to be doing in this? In the midst of these subhuman conditions and smells and difficulties and challenge and poverty and faced with all of these things and brokenness and all of that. When I went to prayer in the presence of the Blessed Sacrament, when I went to Mass, God was giving me the answer. Continue to pour yourself out. He's giving us an example. He's saying, pour yourself out. Continue to do that. Continue to give of yourself. Continue to pour yourself out as I did. Christ is asking us to receive Him, but then to imitate and do what He did. So in one sense, He gives us an example in the Eucharist. He says, I'm pouring myself out completely into these simplest of elements. This bread and wine becomes me, Jesus. And so in doing that, pouring out, I'm showing you an example. And then he's also saying that this food nourishes us, body and soul, so that we have the strength to pour ourselves out. The strength to get back up off the mountain and say, I'm going to go back into that neighborhood. I'm going to go back into that woman's life who needs us, who needs me and you and us. I'm going to go back into that situation. I'm going to go back into my marriage. I'm going to go back into that relationship that's broken, that friendship that needs repair, that relationship with my child, whatever it is, I'm going back in because I have the strength of Christ. He's fed me so that I have the strength to do what He did, which was pour Himself out. Someone told me after the Mass this afternoon over in Brazil, said, Father, I got to stop coming to your Mass because you make me cry when you talk about poor people. And she was saying, you know, I don't ever hear a solution. I said, well, I talked about a solution in the homily, right? She goes, yeah, I know, but there's always a sense of, you know, we want... Mother Teresa was criticized, right? Because she was working in the poorest of the poor. Conditions like I saw times 1,000, right? And surrounded on it for miles and miles and extreme poverty. And people criticize, I didn't even know this was possible until a few years ago. Someone called my attention to it, that a lot of people criticize Mother Teresa for not working more on government programs or solutions, quote unquote. The church says, we work politically. We don't just walk into these situations of poverty and then not care, about what we're doing politically or in our governments to address these situations or care for people. Those things matter too, and we're called to be active political members of our society, engaging in that discussion. But we're also supposed to just go in and be Christ. And that sometimes is the solution, right? Mother Teresa was showing us exactly a way to do that, a way to imitate Christ himself, by just going in. Go in, be present, while working on the other things too. Mother Teresa was very active and also trying to make sure that other people were pulled in, that the government and the laws were fair, all these kinds of things. But we are also called to pour ourselves out. That is the ultimate solution, right? That's what we recognize, hopefully, when we think about the body and blood of Christ. So just as every day, day after day after day, there was manna in the desert, dessert every morning, in the same way, Christ is saying, look, I'm giving you the true bread day after day after day on this altar and on all the altars around the world, day after day after day. And I'm there in every tabernacle around the world, day after day after day. Come, consume me, Jesus says. Come be with me in prayer. I talked to a man before Mass this afternoon in Brazil. And he said, Father, I've been spending an hour a day in the presence of the Blessed Sacrament for about a year now. And he said, it has changed me like I've never been changed in my life. Being in the presence of Him who says, do what I did. Pour yourself out. Just like I do, as Christ does into the bread and wine. We too are called to do that, trusting and knowing that the bread and wine that become Him give us the strength to do it. We pray that we may be more perfect imitators of Christ this day in our life and continue to grow more perfect and more into that sacrificial pouring out that Jesus did perfectly for us 2,000 years ago on the cross.